welcome to this keynote presentation. Well, actually, it's a keynote interview with Dr. David Nabarro. It's my great pleasure to have this discussion with David because he is such a global health hero. His 40-year career has been so impressive that I can only give you a small snapshot of all the amazing work that he's done with the UN Secretary General and Director General of WHO for more than 2 decades. He's worked all around the world on their behalf on multiple infectious disease challenges, you name it, malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, avian flu, Ebola, and now as WHO's Special Envoy on COVID-19. But it's really his vast experience in food and nutrition that we want to discuss, and particularly his role as a senior advisor at the recent UN Food System Summit. In 2009, David took the responsibility of coordinating the UN system's high-level task force on global food security, which must have been a huge effort, pulling together multiple UN agencies and other agencies to create a common strategy to address food and nutrition security. He oversaw the establishment of the Zero Hunger Challenge, scaling up nutrition movement, and he deservedly won the World Food Prize in 2018, for his huge contribution to improving nutrition globally. Some of you may have been involved in one of his food system dialogues that he catalyzed around the world in the lead up to the UN Food System Summit. David, welcome. It's a total pleasure to be able to interview you for these INFORMAS regional eSymposia.
Thank you, Boyd, and it's great to be with you. Thanks also for the nice introduction. I sometimes feel that if you move from assignment to assignment, that's a sign that perhaps you're finding it hard to take them on. So I'm always a bit embarrassed by the fact that I've done a few things, but I enjoy talking about them and focusing on them.
Well, it's what you've learned along the way that we want to hear from you, David, especially in the food and nutrition space. So we'll just kick off. I've got a few questions here that I'd like to put to you. So we've just had the UN Food System Summit. Many have watched it from afar. We all have a great interest in what's been happening, but to be honest, it's been hard work to work out what's been happening. First, it seemed like the NGOs and the civil society sector were getting involved and putting in the hard yards, earnestly putting forward these game-changing ideas about what's needed to turn around food systems, to deliver on health and sustainability and equity and prosperity. But then as we got closer to the date, the member states and the big food companies came in and finished with quite a lot of vague political statements. Now, that's probably a bit of an unfair view from the outside, but you've been there right in the middle of it. So, and you've also seen other UN systems summits come and go. So yes. Can you tell us a bit about this summit? How did the process go? What did it achieve? And how will it make a difference to really getting action on food systems?
Thanks very much, everybody. This was the first ever United Nations Summit on food systems. And that's terribly important because in the past, there have been summits on food production, food loss and waste, or indeed also on food security quite often. But food systems is new. And the reason why the UN Secretary General decided that it was necessary to draw attention to food systems is, as everybody listening would know, that the reality is that food systems in our world today, if they go on as they are, will prevent us all from achieving the goals established in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Quite simply, no chance of achieving them at all. But look at it the other way round. If we can get food systems right, given their contribution to climate change, given their contribution to loss of biodiversity and environmental damage, given their contribution to poor nutrition and health and their contribution to rural poverty, inconceivably, it is possible to use food systems as a means to make a difference in a variety of other interconnected areas that need global attention. In short, food systems have the potential to be an extraordinary transformative force. And so that was the logic that Mr. Guterres had when 2 years ago, i.e. in 2019, he decided he would host this first ever summit. But designing a summit to examine a systems issue and then to try to secure some consensus on what needs to happen to shift the systems issue that's being studied has turned out to be quite difficult. Dr. Agnes Kalibata was appointed as the special envoy for the summit, and I worked as her advisor. We all operated under the direct supervision of the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, who established an advisory committee to navigate us through the preparatory process. When Dr. Kalibata started in early 2020, one of her areas of focus was on trying to establish what are the dimensions of food systems that need to be addressed in the summit. And that led to a fairly early identification of a need to focus on nutrition and health, a need to focus on dietary shifts, a need to focus on nature positive production, as well as focusing on rural prosperity, and a need to examine resilience in food systems. And that's become more and more important, given that the preparations for this summit have coincided with this really serious COVID-19 pandemic that we're all experiencing. Now, the way in which the summit was planned involved digging into these objectives and saying, are there some game-changing solutions that can be identified which would lead to dramatic systems shift in the directions that are desired, and system shift that could actually be undertaken by all, and therefore system shift that would be equitable and sustainable. But I think that quite early on, despite the fact that everybody worked really hard to treat food and food systems in a bit of a linear form by thinking perhaps solutions can be found, that process turned out to be more complex than perhaps had initially been predicted. Here's how it happened. Dr. Kalibata set up a number of what were called action tracks, which were expert groups that would work on these 5 areas that I identified, the 5 objectives. More groups were set up to work on a number of levers of change or enablers that are important as well. And right at the center of that was the right to food and also attention to the Sustainable Development Agenda. There were also groups that were focusing on the position of women and young people, on finance and on innovation. And so as the deepening work of the action tracks, supported by a large science group led by Joachim von Braun, and these levers of change got deeper into trying to identify game-changing solutions. And they did that really through the end of 2020 and the early part of 2021, a challenge started to emerge. Really, these are complex systems, food systems. They have huge variety between place to place. You go into New Zealand, you find lots of different food subsystems inside your islands. And to actually kind of present the challenge as being one where there might be 1 or 2 game changers that could actually shift the systems to a better place implies a very linear approach to addressing the issue. And so Dr. Kalibata, realizing, of course, that the multiple approaches were needed, had in 2020 invited myself and my colleagues to bring multi-stakeholder engagement into the summit preparatory process and to offer a program of food systems summit multi-stakeholder dialogues designed explicitly to expose some of the lock-ins that exist in food and to explore potential for systems shift through re-examining some of the trade-offs that are associated with existing food systems decisions and to explore whether or not there's scope for moving them. This was based in an approach to systems shift that basically starts from the underlying premise that if you can connect together people and issues and enable much wider understanding of the different positions that stakeholders have within the systems, that systems shifting becomes a more realistic proposition. And I've seen this happen in a number of health and food and nutrition issues before. So I actually believe in it. And so at Agnes's encouragement, my team and I, during 2020, developed a program for supporting dialogues independently by anybody who wanted to do them, supporting dialogues by governments so that governments themselves could bring together different stakeholders to explore, and supporting regional and global dialogues. At the beginning, we didn't really imagine there'd be much interest in this process. After all, multi-stakeholder dialogue is not a usual practice in preparing for these kinds of summits, though it has been used in climate summits before. But anyway, we got going, and Deputy Secretary General encouraged independent actors as well as governments to move ahead with this. And we had an extraordinary uptake. By the time of the summit, 148 countries had initiated multi-stakeholder dialogues. And then not only had they done the dialogues, but out of these countries, an even bigger surprise, 104 had done a consolidation of the outcomes of their dialogues and produced strategic pathways to sustainable food systems by 2030 that identified the major decisions that have to be explored and worked through, and also options for bringing stakeholders together to encourage system shift. That process was supported by an awful lot of other dialogues independently, and taken together, we estimate that at least 100,000 people have been involved in this process. Wow. We also don't know how far dialogues have gone because they're continuing all over the world, and countries relatively close to you, like the Pacific Island nations, have taken the process incredibly seriously and intend to go on. So we had, on the one hand, the game-changing solutions, the action tracks, and the rather linear approach to things, which of course still has value. It's not as though everything has to be done through more interconnected systems change work. But we also had the dialogues process underway, taking off in a quite unprecedented manner, and also happening rather later than we'd expected, partly because of COVID and partly because the countries undertaking the dialogues just got so into it that they wanted to do it in great detail. And just bringing it to a quick conclusion, Boyd, although you say that some of the statements that were given by national governments in the more than 130 national statements, about half of which were given by presidents and other heads of state, although you mentioned in the introduction these were vague political statements, I want to say that we've analysed these statements. We've also analysed the publicly posted pathways coming from the 104 countries. We've analysed the feedback from these dialogues that I mentioned. We've analysed over 460 national dialogues and looked at them within the process of progression of dialogues. And we don't see these as vague at all. In fact, what we're actually seeing is a recognition by numerous heads of government, numerous national leaders, that food systems have got to be understood and then subject to systematic efforts for full-scale transformation if the necessary changes are going to be achieved by 2030. And so profound are many of these national statements that the Secretary General has invited all national leaders to come back again to the UN in 2023 and to look at what he said at the beginning of the summit about the urgent priorities for systems shift, and then to look at what they've actually committed to do in many of their pathways and the national statements they gave in the summit, and then to answer the question, have we made the shifts, yes or no, and to actually render accounts to the world for the changes that are being made. The game-changing solutions are still there, but they're not the heart of the system shift that is now underway. They will contribute to action being undertaken in countries and regionally, but enabling the formation of coalitions that can conceivably lead to change. But there's the much bigger issue of the nature of the transformation that's going to be taken forward, and in particular, the underlying principles that will apply to that. And just to finish, we've recently done a synthesis of all the dialogues that we've got details of that were undertaken before mid-August this year. And the one thing that's come through clearly and strongly is that if governments are taking the responsibility for their food systems, they will focus on equity, sustainability, and resilience, because there is a widespread recognition that the current food system situation, with all their major impacts that they are having, is just not good enough. Overall, per year, the total cost of the world's food systems in terms of their impact on people and the environment is estimated to be about $12 trillion US, whereas the total benefits of food systems for society, depending on how you calculate it, of course, come out at around $10 trillion, which means that food systems do have a net cost for humanity. And what we felt at the summit, and what's clear in this post-summit 2-year period that we're now going into, is that there is a real recognition by many national leaders, stimulated, I think, by COVID and climate change and the costs of non-communicable diseases, that things have got to change.
And do you think that the this transition you talked about from linear thinking to systems thinking and understanding the dynamics, the feedback loops, all that sort of thing that comes with systems thinking, was that coming through in these analyses that you've done? I hadn't appreciated that all the stuff was being analysed, so that sounds like a major job, but I'm very pleased to hear your optimism coming out of that.
Well, I'm going to start by saying, when one's doing systems work, it does require a very different way of thinking and working. First of all, you have to accept that there are multiple perspectives on any situation, and it really does not work if you simply label certain perspectives as right and an awful lot of other perspectives as wrong, and then you invest in trying to shift those people who you perceive as being wrong into a right thinking way, and then subject them to your change efforts. That's a conventional approach to trying to change how things work. It often involves an awful lot of talking at people, using PowerPoint slides, invoking various ethical and other criteria for how life should be. It's very top down. It doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work in food, but it doesn't work in other areas where there are complex interconnections and multiple perspectives. So we say straight away, if you're going to approach food as a systems issue, you have to be able to create space in which the different perspectives that are perceived by the system stakeholders can all be held in the same space without any groups feeling that they are or unwanted or objectionable or whatever. That's rule number one. And rule number two is simply to say, well, if we're going to start working together to shift systems, it's no good thinking that any one of us, either individuals or organizations or nations, is going to be able to get away with taking the credit for the shift, because actually collective action for systems shift is just that, it's collective action. So moving from an approach which says we're going to be out in front, we're going to be the leaders, and we're going to try and get everyone else to follow us, and at the same time we're going to try to get them thinking in a pretty singular way as well, to one which is much more accepting of the multiple perspectives and much more accepting of the reality that in systems shift we all need to take the credit. It is tough to do in these quite structured and quite procedural organizations that make up the UN system or make up national governments. It's that business of coping with the incompatibility of many of our structures with the requirements of systems thinking that emerges time and time again in this work, and that really has emerged strongly in the summit preparations. The dialogues that I have been involved in with my team and that have been led from within countries or independently have all demonstrated that different patterns of thought and action are absolutely vital.
So those, I think those are very wise words.
Giving up.
Yeah.
I'm not giving up at all, because I actually believe that humanity has an enormous capacity for collective working. And we've seen it. I mean, there are certain aspects of what's happened recently in your country on dealing with COVID that I totally admire. And by the way, as I watch some of the shifts in position taking place in New Zealand, I say to myself, you know, I hope you don't lose everything brilliant about what's happened with the 5 million response so far, because actually you have achieved such a lot through collective action, and that achievement is absolutely invaluable, because you've got very little virus in the country, and you can work with that to good effect if you adopt now a systems approach. Shifting back to food, I want to say what we have seen through the preparations for the summit is enormous appetite from organizations, whether they're involved in food production or in consumption, or whether they're involved in advocacy or involved in the rights of those particularly traditional indigenous people and their traditional practices being under threat. It's recognizing that they all have a place in systems change, and that's come through very strongly through the dialogue. I think it will take root more and more. My only concern is the length of time it's taking for people everywhere to recognize the different patterns of thought and action, and indeed governance, that are required if we're going to adopt systems change approaches. If we wait too long, the task ahead just becomes harder and harder and harder, because things that are increasing in gravity exponentially are always tougher to deal with the longer you wait. And so whether it's food, or whether it's climate change, or whether it's public health, or whether it's migration or access to water, or the other difficult issues that we're dealing with, all I say to friends and colleagues is get working on these complexities quickly in a multi-stakeholder interconnected way, because there's no time to lose.
Yep, and I think we feel it whenever we do these system dialogues, the energy that comes out from multiple sources, and that is a great source of ongoing energy. Can I just turn attention to the issue of ultra-processed food, because a lot of people in the audience will work in the area of trying to reduce obesity and diet-related NCDs, which is the biggest contributor, as you know, to health loss in most countries. And it's really ultra-processed foods which dominate the diets of high and middle income countries, and increasingly in low income countries, which are the drivers of these diet-related NCDs. However, when you look through the game-changing solutions and the action clusters and coalition statements and things that came out from the summit, you won't find much reference to this huge part of this food system that needs addressing. So why is this critical part of the food system kind of keep disappearing from sight when it comes to taking action?
Thanks, Boyd. I'm really not wanting to dig into what happened in the work on in the action tracks and the game-changing solutions, except to say that I had not seen the focus on the importance of dietary shift disappear from the thinking. It must have been in some of the reporting or readouts that it was perhaps less evident. So just let me put a marker on that, if necessary, I'll come back to that. But I do want to say tell you what happened in the national dialogues. I want to start with the example of the dialogues coming from at least 10 Pacific Island nations. Right at the center of the analysis that was undertaken in the Pacific was one really disturbing reality, and that is that these countries are absolutely overwhelmed by the social and economic cost of an epidemic of non-communicable diseases that can be pretty largely attributed, I never like saying absolutely directly attributed, but it's strong to the shift in diet of people in these countries, the shift towards obesogenic and energy-dense foods, and these in turn being directly associated with an alarming incidence of particularly type 2 diabetes and complications, also cardiovascular disease and complications, and just straightforward obesity, which, as we've seen from COVID and other conditions, has direct health impacts itself. But it doesn't stop there. The nature of the dietary shift and its impact on health and well-being everywhere has come out in dialogues, particularly in island nations and import-dependent nations, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, and very strongly in the Caribbean during the summit, and in many other developing nations. And it needs direct attention. More than half the national government pathways that have been developed have non-communicable diseases and the importance of dietary shift strongly in the center. Many of the countries undertaking dialogues, particularly those that are import dependent, just identified the absolute need to pay attention to the nature of imports, to the dietary consumption practices of people, incentivizing diets that are not obesogenic, not bad for health, and also perhaps most importantly, to reduce import dependence by greater local production and local consumption of sustainable, nutritious and healthy foods produced in ways that do contribute to poverty reduction and well-being. It was as though there was a recognition that the current system was actually doing harm to people and to the planet and to the economies and to society in so many nations and needed concerted political attention. Now you could say to me, David, why hasn't this happened before? Well, I just don't think we've ever had before a summit process which has actually deliberately seeded a dialogue and then what has become a multi-actor policy consultation in many countries during the last few months that's led to the central importance of non-communicable diseases, the central importance of dietary shift just coming up more and more. Now, will it actually happen? Well, as many of the dialogue participants made clear, this depends on governments actually taking seriously the aspects of food policy that have got to have attention. And right at the center of that is the impact of what people eat on their nutrition and on their health. So the question that I think is going to be faced in the next 2 years is, will the clear will of government, the willingness of governments to actually approach this as a key policy issue translate into practice? And I can't answer that question, but whether we go to Latin America, where there's clearly a strong focus on this, particularly Mexico going south down the Andes, or these island nations, I can't answer the question, but I'll be watching them very, very closely, because the debate has now come out of the health sector and out of the health organizations and health-based civil society, and is going right across all food actors, the recognition that it's absolutely key to focus on dietary shift to try to reduce this enormous burden on NCDs and other ill health impacts.
So that's true around dietary shifts, and that's very dependent on changes in food environments. And that really relates to a lot of the interests in the people who'll be listening here, because our expertise is in measuring multiple dimensions of food environments. And so we can contribute to the accountability cycle, or the accountability ecosystem, as some people call it. But how can people here who are using that expertise for monitoring for accountability become involved in this? Are the commitments by the countries specific enough to be monitored and evaluated? A number of people, a few hundred scientists from around the world have signed up this accountability pact to increase the role of monitoring and measuring actions of governments and food companies, and also changes in food environments that are needed. How can we become involved in this whole process around monitoring for accountability?
Thanks very much, Boyd. When I read about INFORMAS and the willingness of members of the network who've signed the Accountability Pact to get more deeply into this area, my immediate reaction was, great. You see, this work that we're all involved in on systems shift only has meaning if we're able to share methods for measuring different aspects of systems behavior, so that those who are involved in the shift can explore the extent to which they are succeeding in making that shift happen. Now, anybody who's involved in this work knows that actually measuring the change in systems performance is never an easy thing to do, because quite often what we measure are variables that are not directly at the center of what the system's doing. For example, malnutrition itself is both an outcome variable and an input variable to multiple processes, but it's only a marker of what's happening inside the system. So we have to all the time have an element of questioning, humility certainly, but also uncertainty about our ways of measurement. So let's go into it with that humility and take that for granted. We are learning as we do. Secondly, let's go into it with an open mind. This is much harder, but here's the issue. Many people who are involved in encouraging food systems change have quite definite views about some of the underlying conditions that are wrong, that are leading to systems behaving as they are. In particular, they are concerned that there is just far too much power in the hands of large corporations that have direct control over big supply chains that move across countries. So they are both determining what is produced in terms of food, and then they're determining how it's presented to people, especially the degree to which it's processed and transformed. And there is such an anxiety about that, what some refer to as power asymmetry, that many of those who are active for change say, well, we don't want to work alongside these very powerful and in some ways challenging companies, because they represent in a way the force that we're trying to push back. And that, of course, is an absolutely valid position. I mean, it's a position in history that often groups will say, well, I just won't sit at the same table with my adversaries. I won't even enter into discourse with my adversaries because I just don't agree with them and I don't agree with their methods. And so there has been underlying this summit that we're talking about a sense of frustration with the process, particularly from groups that are really of the opinion that unless you start from the right to food and its full realization and the political processes that go with that, it's really not a lot of point in working on food systems. And so a large group actually completely boycotted the whole process. And that's more than just a withdrawal of the whole of the civil society mechanism of the Committee on Food Security and many who work with them, but it also creates a sort of feeling that the summit was incomplete. My answer to that is there will always be periods when, in trying to do multi-stakeholder working, there will be groups who say, we just don't like the terms of engagement. We don't want to be engaged. They're working against us. For example, Indigenous people often consider that their participation in process is tokenistic and they don't want to go in under those terms. So we've had immense discussions with Indigenous peoples groups who took part in the preparation of the summit, but said very clearly to us that the terms of engagement have just got to change. Otherwise, it's not reasonable. And so that's where I would like to say to INFORMAS, do please, if you can, go in with as much openness as you can bring into your disposition as you can possibly manage. Obviously, you do need, when you're working with private sector companies, particularly if you're worried about their behavior in relation to NCDs, or if you're worried in relation to their behavior around the environment, or if you're worried in relation to their behavior on wages and the conditions of low-income food workers. Ground rules for your engagement. Establish the way you wish to be recognized, establish the way you wish to be treated. I mean, it's doable. The companies are aware that that's necessary, but try to be as principled as you can, because if you're doing that and at the same time you're going onto social media and writing really quite blood-curdling comments on the motives and values of the people you're dealing with, then it's quite hard to work with them. I mean, that's one of the things we learned through the dialogue. There is a set of principles that you have to have on how we behave. And if we can get those right, then we are able to work with those with whom we don't agree. But more importantly, we're also able to explore how accounting for what's done using matrices that are produced in a really rigorous way can then actually be taken into account and used as a basis for shifting on a number of key issues. Why do I say that? Because of working with a small number of the companies that are often criticized, but the companies that are already prepared to make the move. I mean, they're quite household names like Unilever, like Danone. Obviously, there are things that some will not agree with, but what I'm finding is that they want to include into their business practice indicators that are able to help them shift their business processes if the measurements done correctly in order to deal with some of the issues that I've identified. So I think INFORMAS, with open mind, with a willingness to do, last point, long-term engagement with a number of different actors contributing to the accountability cycle, you will be received with open arms. And you will be valued, because it is the lack of information that is making it so hard to get shifts on some of these key areas that you've identified. But by all means, please prove me wrong. I'm somebody who believes that you generate hypotheses in order to be disproved. But my current hypothesis is that there is a real willingness among those who are often identified as the most culpable in food systems challenges to explore the use of the kind of information that INFORMAS is working with as part of a longer term approach to system shift.
Thanks for that, David. And we do prize actually the independence, as academics do, of their research, and that actually has a value in and of itself. But when you look at scientists, nutrition scientists, we tend to be very comfortable with well-defined kind of atomized world of nutrients and controlled trials and measured knowns and facts and so on. That may not equip us particularly well for dealing in the systems level. So the mindsets, the training, how do we deal with complex, adaptive, highly political systems like this? You know, what are the food system leaders of today and tomorrow look like? Coming out, we come from an academic base. There is rigor, there's independence, and that's our kind of modus operandi. But actually, we do need to work within these complex adaptive systems. And what is the future leaders going to look like coming into nutrition?
Well, Boyd, you've actually just put into words what I walk around with in my head all the time these days. And I really would like to dig into what you just said and consider its implications. Let's start with this notion of comfort versus discomfort. Working with complex systems and trying to change them so that they obey, or not obey, that's the wrong word, so they perform according to different principles and values is an uncomfortable process. It's messy. Things don't fit into neat boxes. You don't know whether you're succeeding because the normal feedback loops for feeling good about achieving results don't quite work when you're doing systems change, because you very rarely see direct results from what you do. There's very little gratification in that extent. You also come across sometimes, compared with your peers, as a bit surprising or even odd. And so there can be moments when the systems change actor feels ostracized, feels disliked, feels that they are perceived to be not part of a tribe or a club of a particular discipline, for example. It's uncomfortable. And I don't think that many of us who've been trained as scientists actually enjoy discomfort. I think we'd rather work and exist in places where we feel comfortable, where we can anticipate the reactions of our colleagues to things that we'll say and do, where we know that we will get applause and support from our audiences for the things we say, because we're staying on a line that makes them comfortable. And I think we don't actually like mess. We've got really unused to the adaptive behavior that's needed when you are in the messy context. We like to be in big institutions because they provide a kind of cushioning against some of the rough and tumble of outside. So we yearn to be in headquarters of organizations because the periphery is always a bit more challenging. And yet, those of us who are going to be trying to offer scientific inputs to systems change have got to be able to work in that mess, that discomfort, have got to be okay with the notion that our advice may not be accepted. But that doesn't mean we go off and sulk. It means we come back and say, okay, I'll offer it again next time. And perhaps most importantly of all, those of us who work in science have got used to the way science is divided into disciplines. Those disciplines definitely have some centralizing and comfort-giving potential. They also provide norms against which we're judged. And in particular, as we go deeper into our subjects, those norms relate to peer-reviewed research. So those are norms which are quite controlling. And there is systematic discouragement of working across disciplines or working in fully applied contexts because it's harder to get our papers accepted in refereed journals. But we don't use things like randomized controlled trials when we're directly involved in systems change, because obviously we don't have a chance to create these experiments in quite the protected way in which is desired. But at the same time, we're doing life experiments all the time. And actually, if we're doing systems change in a scientific way, it needs to be chronicled in real time with living histories, because the science of systems change is the science of tracking the ways in which decision-making alters in the light of new forms of trade-off being applied as a result of new connections being made inside our systems. And that is where my own work is going to concentrate in the coming months and years, is focusing on the value of connecting and bringing about change, and the value of connecting, for example, new interdisciplinary scientific thinking, that's the kind of thinking necessary for the Sustainable Development Agenda, into decision-making processes, recognizing that can be comfortable, but the reason why I want to do this is that I think power in the future will lie with the connectors who can link together folk with very different perspectives on issues, and in that way create the climate for systems shift that is so necessary. Perhaps I shouldn't have said power, because I'm not quite sure that I'm there talking about the same power as the power imbalances in food systems that I talked about earlier. What I should instead say is that the greatest influence will probably come from the connectors, and that means the future university ought to be focusing on connecting between disciplines and connecting science with practice within complex systems, and helping the scientists who get involved and the practitioners who are dealing with the scientists to cope with the discomfort. Because that's the last thing I want to say really in this segment is, it is the discomfort that is the hardest part. It is our yearning as human beings to be in comfortable settings, predictable settings, and emotionally warm and reinforcing settings that make actual participation in systems change quite challenging. And so I've said to many of my colleagues, probably what you need to do is to really pace yourself, that you do periods of intense engagement in systems change, and then you withdraw and you go perhaps to a retreat, or you go to a university place and you write a paper or a book, or you do some seminars and you reflect. And so you are able to combine that sort of kind of rerouting yourself and getting yourself back to centering your emotional and your intellectual sort of thinking, and then you go back into the discomfort, because that, I think, is going to be the pattern for the future.
Well, that's good advice. There's lots of bright people coming through in this whole field. So you do write quite a lot about seeing the whole and feeling the rhythm and managing the uncertainty. And so it'll be interesting for people listening to you to take that focus. And it's certainly true in the monitoring and the measuring space that we do focus on the variables, the visible things that we can measure readily, rather than the relationships between them, or even the underlying paradigms or mindsets that are driving the whole system. So finally, David, just looking ahead, we've had the Food Systems Summit, and I'm very pleased to hear about your optimism around how countries are responding to that, and large companies. But there's a whole lot of other similar high-level meetings coming up. We've got the COP26 coming up in Glasgow, the N4G, Nutrition for Growth, in Tokyo at the end of this year. We've got a group, and a growing group of people interested in these measuring, wanting to get the most leverage from these high-level meetings. Should we be staying as kind of independent monitors, or joining forces with the government? Should we be sticking with our knitting, which started off in the obesity NCD space, or trying to broaden into nutrition, food security, sustainability, these things? These are the sort of dimensions, I guess, and the tensions that we're facing as a group of researchers intimately interested in and passionate about this area, wanting to apply our skills to it. But just looking forward to these large meetings. How do we become involved and lever off those?
First of all, remember that the large meetings are really taking an abstraction from complex systems everywhere. Often they try to linearize because they're trying to pick out big issues that need massive effort to get a shift, like constant increasing emissions of greenhouse gases. And so you pick the issue out, you bring it up to high level, and it becomes linear. But in real life, when you get into the detail of systems change, linear doesn't work. So you have to use the big meeting as the part of the provider of the context. But don't let the big meeting and what's discussed at the big meeting somehow kind of wipe away out of your brain the understanding of the complexity of systems, the messiness of systems. And so my last point to you, Boyd, is if we're going to work in support of systems change, we have to have a place where we work, because everything happens in a place. All systems can adapt and adjust in relation to the context within which they're working, particularly the political and human context. So please stay located in place. And secondly, stay connected to people, because actually helping folk to get comfortable with systems working is a continuous process, a mentoring process. We have to mentor each other to do it. So please stay connected to a reasonably consistent group of people, all the time making sure you don't have groupthink creeping in, but you just need that for at least having some centeredness, place and people, and then understand what's going on in the sort of high-level meeting world as part of the context, but do your work always in the place with the people and through constant chronicling, because in my view, as of now, at least, that is what I've concluded is the way to do it. So I will constantly flip between big meeting thinking and trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand the positions, and place-based and people-based working. Please, it's going to be obviously COP26 and N4G. Remember, we're just beginning to learn how to bring systems issues up into the global environment. We're very much influenced in the global environment by the social media world, where if things are not turned into really extreme positions, folk don't really sort of take any notice of them. So quite often, the people running the big meetings get trapped in the need to make something that is summitable, and that leads them to go down linear paths. So don't get too discouraged if the big meetings leave you underwhelmed. You have to often look underneath what's happening in the big chamber and the words of the high-ups to try to see, well, is there interconnected working? Is there multi-stakeholder involvement? Is there new forms of governance emerging? That's where hopefully the fun will come. I don't think the leadership of the future will necessarily be the leaders of our nations, current or future. I think the leadership of the future will come out in different ways and will often present itself as the people who work out of the limelight, but who have the skills necessary to patiently but urgently nurture system shift in a big way.
Wow, well, I think you've brought us back to a place where we can at least get our head around it. And I think, as you have indicated with all your sage advice and commentary and stories, painted a picture of how we can become involved at a local level, at a national level, pay attention to the relationships, think about systems, get the head into systems thinking, try to shift some of our science and our research towards measuring the systems as well as the variables which pop out from the systems. So thank you very much indeed, David. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure people in the INFORMAS eSymposia around the world will enjoy listening to you. Namaste.
Thank you very much. Namaskar. But I would like to say to everybody, one's utility is only as good as it actually is. So the one thing I like to do is to hear from people who think that what I have said is completely impossible for them to apply, to challenge me, but also to hear from people who've tried some of this stuff out in their own lives and who've got lessons to share, because this is a collective job. None of us can do it alone. No discipline can do it alone. No country can do it alone. No community can do it alone. This is the ultimate collective challenge that lies ahead of us, and that's actually making sure that our world is livable for the next 7 generations. Thank you very much indeed, Boyd. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you
for your leadership.